Bronson Reed is fighting for his career after Brock Lesnar unleashed the most savage and potentially career-ending assault in WWE history, and if you're not absolutely horrified by the level of brutality that left the 330-pound monster motionless on a stretcher with medical personnel frantically working to stabilize his spine, you clearly don't understand how dangerous this situation has become. What we witnessed wasn't just excessive wrestling violence, it was a systematic attempt to permanently injure another human being that has crossed every conceivable line between entertainment and genuine assault. The sight of Bronson Reed, a man who seemed absolutely invincible just minutes earlier, being loaded into an ambulance with a neck brace and full spinal stabilization while Brock Lesnar stands in the ring showing zero remorse, will haunt the wrestling world forever and raise serious questions about what WWE allows in the name of entertainment. This wasn't competition, this was attempted destruction of a man's livelihood and potentially his ability to ever walk normally again. Brock has completely lost control. Somebody needs to stop this madness. Those weren't just panicked words from shocked commentators, they were desperate pleas from people who realized they were watching something that had gone horribly wrong and transformed from scripted entertainment into a genuine medical emergency. The terror and urgency in their voices tells you everything about how serious this became. You want to talk about attacks that redefine excessive violence and force wrestling to confront uncomfortable questions about where entertainment ends and assault begins? Brock Lesnar didn't just defeat Bronson Reed, he destroyed him with such unrelenting savagery that even WWE officials are reportedly questioning whether the Beast should face criminal charges for what amounts to aggravated assault captured on live television. The match had been progressing as a legitimate competitive contest between two superhuman athletes when something inside Brock Lesnar snapped in a way that terrified everyone watching. The exact trigger remains unclear, but witnesses describe a visible transformation in his demeanor, from controlled professional aggression to unhinged berserker rage that made everyone realize this situation was spiraling completely out of control. But here's what makes this attack absolutely terrifying and different from typical wrestling violence: it wasn't a brief moment of lost control that ended quickly. This was sustained, methodical destruction specifically and deliberately designed to damage Bronson Reed's spine and neck to the point where his ability to ever wrestle again becomes genuinely questionable. The premeditation and sustained nature make it exponentially worse. The most shocking aspect of Brock's assault was how he targeted the same vulnerable body parts repeatedly with increasing severity and complete disregard for Reed's safety. First came a German suplex that drove Reed's neck into the canvas at a dangerous angle that made everyone wince. Then another. And another. 15 consecutive German suplexes, each one more brutal and reckless than the last, with Reed clearly unable to properly protect himself after the first few. Here's a question that's going to reveal just how unprecedented and dangerous this level of sustained violence truly was. Did you notice how Bronson Reed completely stopped trying to fight back or protect himself after approximately the 8th suplex, strongly suggesting he may have already been seriously injured, but Brock continued the assault anyway for 7 more devastating impacts? The turning point from dangerously aggressive to potentially catastrophic came when Brock dragged Reed's limp and clearly unconscious body outside the ring and deliberately positioned him against the unforgiving steel ring post. What happened next was so vicious and disturbing that multiple fans in the front rows reportedly covered their eyes or turned away completely, unable to watch the brutality unfold. Brock delivered a running knee strike with his full 286-pound frame directly to Reed's head while it was pinned helplessly against the steel post with such tremendous force that the sickening crack of impact echoed through the entire arena like a gunshot. Reed's massive body immediately went completely limp in a way that medical professionals immediately recognized as indicating potential serious neurological trauma. But instead of stopping when Reed's body went limp, the universal signal that something has gone terribly wrong, Brock seemed to become even more aggressive and violent. He lifted Reed's unconscious 330-pound frame with disturbing ease and delivered a devastating F5 directly onto the steel steps with such tremendous force that the reinforced steps literally broke apart and scattered across ringside from the catastrophic impact. Quick question for the physics and biomechanics experts: how much force would be required to actually break apart WWE's specially reinforced steel steps? And what kind of catastrophic spinal and internal injuries would someone realistically suffer from being F5'd with that level of destructive impact? The most infuriating and genuinely disturbing aspect of this entire disaster is that WWE officials, referees, and security personnel were screaming at Brock to stop the assault, but he completely ignored every attempt at intervention and continued his systematic destruction of Reed's body. Multiple referees tried desperately to physically intervene and pull Brock away, only to be violently thrown aside like insignificant obstacles by the Beast, who had clearly lost all connection to reality and professional boundaries. The security footage captured from multiple camera angles shows Brock in what can only be medically described as a dissociative state, eyes wild and unfocused, face contorted with uncontrolled rage, completely disconnected from the normal behavioral constraints and professional boundaries that separate competitive wrestling from genuine criminal violence. This wasn't the Beast Incarnate character, this was something far more dangerous, uncontrolled, and genuinely frightening. But perhaps the most disturbing and heartbreaking moment came when Paul Heyman himself, Brock's closest confidant, longest tenured advocate, and the one person who supposedly understands and can control him better than anyone, desperately tried to calm him down and talk him back to rationality, only to be roughly shoved away with shocking violence. The fact that Brock would physically dismiss and potentially harm the one person he trusts most in this world shows just how completely he had lost control of his actions and mental state. The medical response was immediate once officials finally managed to forcibly pull Brock away from Reed's motionless and disturbingly unresponsive body. Emergency medical technicians rushed to the scene with obvious urgency and immediately called for additional specialized support and equipment, strongly suggesting they recognized the potential severity of spinal or neurological trauma within seconds of their initial assessment. Here's another critical question for the emergency medicine and trauma professionals: what specific physical signs and symptoms do trained emergency responders look for that indicate potential catastrophic spinal injury requiring immediate stabilization? And did you notice any of those critical indicators in how Bronson Reed's massive body was positioned and responding after this vicious attack? The most shocking and deeply concerning revelation from the immediate medical examination is that Bronson Reed was reportedly completely unconscious and showed absolutely no response to external stimuli when EMTs first reached him. The combination of repeated severe head trauma, sustained neck compression from 15 suplexes, and the catastrophic spinal impact from being F5D through steel steps had apparently caused either a severe traumatic brain injury, spinal shock, or something even more medically serious and potentially life-altering. The decision by medical personnel to immediately deploy a rigid backboard with full cervical spine immobilization and carefully coordinate his transfer tells you absolutely everything you need to know about how genuinely grave and potentially life-changing this medical situation had become. Medical professionals don't take those extreme precautions and move with that level of careful coordination unless they have very serious and legitimate concerns about spinal cord integrity and the terrifying risk of permanent paralysis from any improper movement during transport. But the most heartbreaking footage that really drives home the human cost of this violence comes from backstage, where Bronson Reed's family members were urgently brought to the medical treatment area. The sight of his wife breaking down in uncontrollable tears while doctors solemnly explain the potential severity of his injuries and the genuine uncertainty about his future reminds us all that behind every wrestling character and storyline is a real person with a real family who depends on them both financially and emotionally. The testimonies from veteran wrestlers who witnessed this attack firsthand are absolutely chilling and reveal just how unprecedented and disturbing this level of violence truly was. "I've been in this business for over 20 years and I've never seen anything remotely like that," one respected veteran performer revealed with visible distress. Brock's eyes were completely empty and dead, like he wasn't even mentally present or aware of what he was doing. He was just mechanically destroying Bronson with cold precision, systematically targeting the exact same vulnerable areas over and over and over until something catastrophically broke. The psychological profile of what causes an experienced professional athlete to enter that level of dangerous dissociative violence is genuinely terrifying and raises serious questions about mental health screening. When a trained athlete with Brock Lesnar's exceptional strength, technical skill set, and capacity for inflicting damage loses connection with normal behavioral constraints and safety awareness, they become genuinely capable of inflicting catastrophic and potentially permanent damage before anyone can successfully intervene and stop them. Here's a critical question for the sports psychology and behavioral health experts: what specific psychological or neurological factors can cause someone to enter a dissociative state characterized by extreme violence during physical confrontation, and should WWE have comprehensive protocols and trained personnel to identify when performers are entering these dangerous mental states before catastrophic harm occurs? The most infuriating and genuinely enraging response has come from Brock Lesnar himself in the immediate aftermath of this potentially career-ending attack. Instead of showing any appropriate remorse, genuine concern for Reed's medical condition, or basic human empathy, sources report that Brock has been completely and disturbingly unapologetic. He's been making callous comments claiming that Bronson couldn't handle real intensity and actually suggesting that the potentially life-altering injuries are somehow Reed's own fault for being too weak to withstand legitimate violence. The complete victim blaming combined with total absence of empathy or accountability reveals something deeply disturbing and potentially sociopathic about Brock's current psychological state. When someone can deliberately inflict potentially permanent and life-altering injuries on another human being and feel absolutely zero remorse, instead actually blaming the victim for their own suffering, that crosses a very concerning line from competitive intensity into genuinely dangerous personality pathology that makes them a legitimate threat to everyone around them. But perhaps the most shocking and franchise-threatening development is that WWE management is reportedly deeply divided and paralyzed about how to appropriately respond to this situation. Some high-level executives are demanding immediate termination of Brock's contract combined with full cooperation with any potential criminal investigation, while other commercially focused executives are apparently arguing that the massive ratings spike and social media engagement generated by the controversial attack make it paradoxically good for business despite the obvious ethical problems. The corporate calculation and internal debate about whether to prioritize performer safety and basic human decency versus profit margins and commercial controversy reveals some deeply ugly truths about WWE's actual organizational values. When company leadership hesitates even briefly to take decisive protective action against someone who may have permanently paralyzed another wrestler, they're essentially communicating that financial considerations and ratings matter fundamentally more than human well-being and workplace safety. The medical update on Bronson Reed's current condition is absolutely concerning and heartbreaking. Preliminary diagnostic imaging suggests multiple severely cracked ribs, extensive soft tissue damage throughout his entire torso, potential spinal compression at multiple vertebral levels, possible internal organ damage from repeated crushing impacts, and the genuinely terrifying possibility of nerve damage that could permanently affect his mobility, sensation, and quality of life. The medical team treating the 33-year-old performer has indicated he faces an absolute minimum of 6 to 9 months of intensive rehabilitation before even beginning to consider whether returning to professional wrestling might be medically advisable or even physically possible. Here's a sobering question for the orthopedic and rehabilitation medicine experts. At 33 years old, after sustaining this level of comprehensive trauma to the spine, neck, and neurological system, what realistic percentage chance does someone have of ever returning to the extreme physical demands of professional wrestling at their previous performance level? The most shocking revelation that adds another disturbing layer to this tragedy is that Bronson Reed had apparently been wrestling through minor chronic pain in that same vulnerable spinal region for several weeks prior to this attack. Close friends report that he had been receiving regular treatment for what he believed and had been medically told was simply a minor muscular strain, but he continued working his full schedule because he didn't want to lose career momentum during what he viewed as a crucial breakthrough period. The decision to continue performing through pain that we now understand may have been an early warning signal of structural vulnerability is now being seriously questioned by medical experts and safety advocates. If Reed had taken appropriate time off several weeks ago to properly address and fully heal the initial underlying injury, the subsequent catastrophic failure and potential permanent damage might have been entirely prevented. But the most disturbing aspect that reveals systemic problems is that WWE's well-documented organizational culture of celebrating toughness and working through pain may have directly contributed to this tragedy. When wrestlers consistently feel intense pressure, both explicit and implicit, to perform despite injury warning signs because taking time off might cost them opportunities or be perceived as weakness, the cumulative risk of catastrophic failure increases dramatically and dangerously. The investigation into WWE's medical protocols, injury management systems, and whether adequate precautions and proper medical clearances were consistently obtained before allowing Reed to continue performing despite his injury history could have massive legal and regulatory implications for how the company handles performer health going forward. This could potentially trigger external oversight that fundamentally changes industry practices. The fan reaction to Reed's devastating injury and Brock's disturbing lack of remorse has been overwhelmingly supportive of the victim. Wrestling fans worldwide have flooded social media platforms with heartfelt messages of love, genuine prayers for full recovery, and substantial financial support for Reed and his family during this impossibly difficult time when his ability to earn income has been suddenly and violently taken away. Here's an important question about fan responsibility and community support. Beyond social media messages and thoughts and prayers, what practical and tangible ways can wrestling fans meaningfully help performers and their families who are dealing with career-threatening injuries and the resulting financial hardship? The most touching and emotionally powerful responses have come from other wrestling couples and families who deeply understand exactly what Reed's wife and children are experiencing right now. Multiple performers from various promotions have publicly shared their own traumatic stories of watching their life partners suffer devastating injuries, and the shared emotional support and practical advice being offered demonstrates the wrestling community at its absolute best. The wrestling industry has genuinely rallied around Bronson Reed and his family in a beautiful display of solidarity that transcends company affiliations and competitive boundaries. Fundraising initiatives have been rapidly organized, heartfelt messages of encouragement and hope continue pouring in from around the world, and veteran wrestlers who have survived similar career-threatening injuries have graciously offered their hard-won experience, knowledge, and ongoing support for navigating this incredibly difficult rehabilitation journey ahead. But perhaps the most important question that this tragedy forces us all to confront is how it will ultimately affect both Brock's and Reed's futures in professional wrestling. Will Bronson be physically and psychologically capable of recovering fully and eventually returning to the high-impact style that made him such a compelling performer? Will Brock face any meaningful consequences or accountability, or will his commercial value ultimately protect him from appropriate discipline? Will WWE implement any substantive safety reforms, or will this just become another forgotten incident? The long-term implications and potential consequences of this attack extend far beyond just the immediate physical recovery. The psychological trauma and emotional impact on both Reed and his family of having his career and financial security suddenly destroyed through violence could fundamentally affect their mental health, family dynamics, and overall life trajectory for years or potentially decades to come. Here's a philosophical question for the veteran fans and industry observers. At what point does the inherent risk of career-ending injury in professional wrestling become unacceptable, especially for performers with young families who depend entirely on their physical ability to earn income? The coming weeks and months will be absolutely crucial in determining whether Bronson Reed can successfully recover from both the physical injuries and the psychological trauma of this attack, and whether WWE takes any meaningful action to prevent similar tragedies. Either way, the wrestling world will never forget the night that Brock Lesnar's savage attack left Bronson Reed potentially paralyzed. This wasn't entertainment, this was a tragedy that should force the entire wrestling industry to seriously examine safety protocols, medical oversight, and the fundamental question of where the line between acceptable entertainment violence and unacceptable genuine harm should be drawn. Bronson Reed deserves justice, his family deserves support, and the wrestling world deserves answers about how this was allowed to happen.